For 30 years, Alina Voss got up before sunrise, made coffee in the same chipped mug, and went to work building something out of nothing. She never asked her children for anything. Not once. Which is exactly why, at 71 years old, sitting alone at a small kitchen table in a rented house 2 sizes smaller than the home she raised her family in, she counted out cash from an envelope into an old coffee tin and let her children believe there was nothing left to give. She clipped coupons in front of them. She said no to a birthday dinner she could have paid for 100 times over. She let her son believe the business she built from a folding table at a farmer's market had quietly failed her in the end. What none of them knew was that Alina Voss was not poor. She was watching, and what she was about to discover about her own children would lead her to a decision none of them saw coming. This is not a story about a family destroyed by greed. It is a story about a mother who needed to know, before she ran out of time to know it, whether the love her children had for her would survive the moment they believed she had nothing left to offer them. It is a story about the quiet, devastating experiment of a woman who spent her whole life giving, and who decided, near the end of it, to stop giving just long enough to see who would still show up. And it is a story about what she found. Some of what she found broke her heart. Some of it healed something she didn't know was still wounded. And one piece of what she found was so much worse than she expected that, by the time she understood the whole truth, she realized her decision would have to be far more serious than she ever intended. Before we dive deeper, welcome to Scars and Stories. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We will love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's dive right into the story. Alina had 3 children. Daniel, the eldest, 46 years old, a man who had built a life that looked successful from the outside. A nice house, a title in commercial real estate, 2 kids in good schools, and a wife who believed everything was fine because Daniel had made sure she never saw the parts that weren't. Christine, 43, a nurse and a single mother, the one who showed up. She drove Alina to appointments. She sat with her in waiting rooms. She never asked her mother for $1, not once, not even when her own bank account was thinner than anyone knew. And Mark, 38, the youngest, who had been gone from the family for 6 years after a bitter argument at his father's funeral over money that was never actually his to fight about, an argument that left a wound so deep that Mark simply stopped coming home, sending nothing but a card each December, a few polite words, and a silence that Alina felt every single day. To understand what Alina did, you have to understand who she was before any of this began. She met her husband Richard at 19, married him at 20, and by 25 she was running a household on almost nothing while Richard worked construction to keep them afloat. She started selling handmade table linens and kitchenware at a farmer's market on weekends, just to bring in a little extra, and within a decade that folding table had become Voss Home and Table, a company with a warehouse, a small staff, and enough revenue that by the time Richard suffered a stroke at 54, Alina was the one who kept the family financially standing while also learning to feed her husband, dress him, and love a man who could no longer say her name the way he used to. She did this while raising 3 children who watched their mother work harder than anyone they had ever known, and who absorbed, each in their own way, a lesson about what love was supposed to look like. Daniel absorbed ambition, but a fragile kind, the kind that needed constant proof it was working, because he had watched his father go from strong to broken in an instant, and some part of him decided very young that security was the only thing that mattered, and that he could never, under any circumstances, be seen as someone who was struggling. Christine absorbed usefulness. She learned that being needed was the same thing as being loved, and she built her entire identity around being the daughter who never caused a problem and always solved one. Mark absorbed something quieter and sadder, the sense that he was the afterthought, the youngest in a house where his older brother chased success loudly, and his sister earned praise by being helpful, while Mark simply existed in the space between them, never quite sure where he fit, and carrying that uncertainty into adulthood like a stone in his pocket he never put down. For years, this family functioned the way most families do, imperfectly, but functionally. There were Sunday dinners. There were birthdays. There was a version of closeness that, from the outside, looked like it would last forever. But underneath, small cracks were already forming, long before Alina ever thought about testing anyone. 2 Thanksgivings before this story truly begins, Daniel called his mother, and in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation, almost as an afterthought, he asked her whether she still had that account from when the business sold. He said it casually, the way people ask about weather, but Alina noticed. She noticed the way his voice changed slightly when he asked, the way the question didn't quite match the rest of the conversation, and she filed it away without saying anything, the way mothers do when they're not ready to know what they suspect. Around that same time, Christine began quietly taking on more of her mother's expenses without ever mentioning it. A grocery run here, a copay there, small amounts that added up over months into something significant. Money Christine genuinely could not spare on a nurse's salary while raising a teenager alone. But she never said a word, because saying it out loud felt like keeping score, and Christine had spent her whole life believing that love wasn't supposed to keep score. What she didn't realize was that the resentment was accumulating anyway, quietly, in a place she wasn't looking. And Mark, 4 states away, continued sending a card every December, the same 3 or 4 sentences each year, polite, distant, careful. Alina kept every single one of those cards in a drawer in her bedroom, and some nights, more than anyone in her family would have guessed, she took them out and read them again, searching for something warmer between the careful, guarded lines. The moment that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Alina, rushing to answer the phone, tripped on a loose stair runner in her old house and fell hard enough to need an ambulance. It wasn't life-threatening. A fractured wrist and a concussion, but it was serious enough to put her in a hospital bed for 2 nights, serious enough to make her children finally think, in different ways, about what would happen to their mother and to her money if something worse ever happened. It was in that hospital, in a hallway just outside her room, that Alina overheard something she was never supposed to hear. She had asked a nurse to help her to the bathroom, and on the way back, moving slowly with a walker, she heard Daniel's voice around the corner, low, urgent, on the phone with someone she didn't recognize. He wasn't asking about her condition. He was asking whether properties like hers, given the size of the business sale years earlier, would need to go through probate quickly, and how long something like that usually took, and whether there were ways families sometimes avoided the wait. Alina stood frozen in that hallway, her wrist throbbing under a temporary splint, and listened to her eldest son discuss her death in hypothetical, practical terms, while she was still very much alive 20 feet away. She said nothing. She let the nurse walk her back to bed. She lay there that night staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation, telling herself there could be an innocent explanation, that grief made people think strange thoughts even before there was anything to grieve, that maybe Daniel was scared, not greedy. But underneath that generous interpretation was a colder, harder question that she could not shake. What if her son was already thinking about her death as an opportunity rather than a loss? And if he was, how would she ever know for certain, as long as he believed she still had something worth waiting for? That question became an idea, and the idea became a decision, made not in anger but in something closer to grief. The grief of a woman beginning to suspect that the family she built might not be what she always believed it was. The next morning, before she was even discharged, Alina called the only person she fully trusted with something this delicate, her attorney and closest confidant, a sharp, careful woman named Renee Ashford who had handled Alina's business and personal affairs for over 15 years. Alina told Renee, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she wanted to become poor. Not actually. On paper, and in every conversation with her children, starting immediately. Renee, who knew Alina well enough to take this seriously rather than dismiss it, asked her the obvious question. Why? And Alina's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. She said she had built everything in her life by working for it, and she had raised 3 children who she hoped had learned the same lesson, but she was no longer sure that was true, and she would rather know the painful truth now, while she still had time to do something about it, than die peacefully believing a comfortable lie. Over the following months, with Renee's careful legal guidance, Alina restructured everything. She sold the storefront that had remained in her name even after she'd stepped back from daily operations. quietly moved the proceeds and her other assets into accounts and trusts her children had no visibility into, and downsized from her home into a modest 2-bedroom rental in a working-class neighborhood 20 minutes from where she used to live. To her children, the story was simple. The sale of the business years earlier had covered far less than they assumed after debts. Richard's medical bills and taxes had been settled, and what remained had dwindled faster than expected. She was, as far as they knew, living carefully on a fixed and shrinking income. In truth, Alina Voss was sitting on assets worth just over $4 million, and not one of her 3 children had any idea. What happened next unfolded slowly, over roughly a year and a half, and it happened differently for each of her children, in ways that revealed exactly what Alina had feared, and in one case, something far more serious than she had feared. Christine's response came first, and it came without hesitation. Within weeks of learning her mother had downsized, Christine began showing up more, not less. She drove Alina to every doctor's appointment. She started quietly paying for a few extra hours each week from Alina's home health aide, a warm, observant young woman named Priya Malhotra, without ever telling her mother or her siblings that she was doing it. She brought groceries every Sunday and never once mentioned money, because to Christine, mentioning it would have felt like turning care into a transaction, and some part of her, the part shaped by a childhood of proving her worth through usefulness, could not bear the idea of her mother thinking her love came with an invoice. But underneath that quiet generosity, a resentment was accumulating that Christine herself barely allowed herself to name. She was exhausted. She was underpaid. She was raising a teenage daughter largely alone. And she was doing all of this while her older brother, as far as she could tell, was doing almost nothing. Daniel's response was different, and it began to reveal cracks that Alina had only suspected before. His visits, which had already been infrequent, became rarer still, but when he did visit, the conversation kept drifting, subtly at first and then less subtly, toward questions about Alina's finances. Did she have anything set aside? Was the rental month to month or under a lease? Had she looked into whether she qualified for any assistance programs? He dressed each question in the language of concern, but Christine, who was present for several of these conversations, began to notice a pattern that made her deeply uneasy, though she said nothing at first, because confronting Daniel felt like opening a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. Mark's response was the one that surprised Alina the most. Hearing through Christine, in one of their rare phone calls, that their mother was struggling, Mark did something none of them expected. He sent money. Not a large amount, an amount that clearly cost him something to spare, wired quietly with no note attached, no explanation, and no mention of it to anyone in the family. Alina found out only because Renee happened to notice the transfer while reviewing Alina's accounts. And when Alina asked Renee to quietly confirm where it came from, she sat with that knowledge for days, unable to fully process that the son who had stayed away the longest, the son she assumed had the least reason to care, was the one who gave without asking for a single thing in return. It would be easy to say that from there, things simply got worse, but the truth is more complicated, because for a long stretch of this year and a half, there were moments that looked like healing even as the deeper fractures widened underneath. There was a dinner, arranged by Christine, where for one evening the old warmth seemed to return, where Daniel made everyone laugh the way he used to as a teenager, where Alina allowed herself to believe, just for a few hours, that maybe she'd been wrong to doubt her children at all. But before the night ended, Daniel steered the conversation once again toward Alina's finances, gently probing whether she'd considered selling anything else, and Christine, watching her brother do this for what felt like the 10th time, quietly decided she would never fully trust his motives again, though she said nothing that night, choosing instead to carry the disappointment silently, the way she carried most things. There were quieter moments too, ones no one else witnessed. Alina, watching Priya help her into bed one night after a long day, felt a wave of guilt so strong that she almost told Priya the entire truth on the spot, almost called Christine right, then to confess what she had been doing and why. But she stopped herself, because some part of her still needed to know more before she could face what she might have to do with what she learned. There were nights Alina took out Mark's old birthday cards and read them again, this time with a new tenderness, wondering whether the son she had underestimated for years had actually been the one paying the closest attention all along. And there were nights Daniel sat alone in his car outside his own house, unable to go inside, because the truth he was hiding from his wife and everyone else had become too heavy to carry through the front door. Because here is the piece of this story that no one, not even Christine, fully understood yet. Daniel was not simply curious about his mother's finances out of greed. Daniel was 2 months away from losing his own home. The success everyone saw from the outside, the title, the house, the 2 kids in good schools, was propped up by debt so severe that a single missed payment could have brought the entire structure down. And Daniel, terrified of being seen as the failure he believed his own father had become after the stroke, had spent years hiding this from everyone he loved, including his wife, who still believed everything was fine. It was this fear, not simple greed, that had driven Daniel's questions about his mother's money. And it was this same fear that eventually led him to do something far more serious than asking uncomfortable questions at a dinner table. Convinced that his mother was hiding assets, and increasingly desperate as his own financial situation worsened, Daniel hired a private investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Todd Kessler, to look into whether Alina had sold her business for significantly more than she had ever admitted to her children. This is where the story stops being simply about resentment and starts becoming something with real consequences, because what Todd Kessler found, and what he was asked to look into next, would change everything. Todd confirmed, within a few weeks, that Alina's finances did not add up the way she had presented them, that the sale of the business years earlier had almost certainly generated far more than the family believed, and that Alina's current lifestyle appeared to be, in his words, a performance rather than a reality. Daniel, hearing this, did not confront his mother. Instead, frightened and desperate, he asked Todd to go further, to quietly research what it would take to have a family member's competency evaluated. Just in case, should Alina's health decline in a way that made her decision-making questionable. A request that, whatever Daniel told himself in the moment, was effectively an early step toward laying the groundwork to challenge his own mother's control over her own money, should the opportunity ever present itself. This is the piece Alina did not know yet, and this is the piece that, once she learned it, would push her final decision into territory far more serious than she had ever intended when this whole experiment began. The truth came out through Priya. While helping Alina organize paperwork one afternoon, Priya came across documents from Renee's office that made no sense next to the modest life Alina was supposedly living. And rather than ignore it, Priya, who had grown genuinely fond of Alina over many months of quiet caretaking, gently asked her about it. Alina, caught, and perhaps relieved on some level to finally say it out loud to someone, told Priya the truth. Priya became the first person outside Renee to know that Alina Voss was not poor at all, and had never been. It was shortly after this conversation that Renee called Alina with news that would change the entire trajectory of what came next. Renee had learned, through a routine background check she ran as part of updating Alina's estate documents, standard practice given the size of the assets involved, that a private investigator had been retained to look into Alina's finances, and that the same investigator had made inquiries about the legal threshold for petitioning a competency evaluation on an elderly individual. When Renee traced the retainer, it led back to Daniel. Alina sat with this information for 3 full days before she said anything to anyone. She thought about the boy who used to help her wrap orders at the kitchen table as a teenager. She thought about the frightened, defensive tone in his voice at that dinner, the way he never quite looked at her when he asked about her finances. She thought about how easy it would have been to believe he was simply anxious, simply human, simply a son worried about his mother's future, and how devastating it was to now understand that his anxiety had curdled into something calculated enough to involve a stranger digging through her private affairs and quietly preparing the legal groundwork to potentially argue, one day, that she was no longer fit to make her own decisions. When Alina finally confronted Daniel, she did not do it with anger. She did it the way she had done most difficult things in her life, quietly, directly, without theater. She told him she knew about the investigator, She told him she knew about the competency inquiry. And she watched her 46-year-old son, a man who had spent his whole adult life performing success, break down completely at her kitchen table, admitting through tears that he was terrified, that he was 2 months from losing everything, that he had told himself for months that what he was doing was simply protecting the family's future, and that he only now, hearing his mother say it back to him plainly, understood how far he had let that fear carry him. Alina listened to all of it. She did not excuse it, but she also did not turn away from it entirely, because understanding why someone does something terrible does not erase the terrible thing, but it does change how you decide to respond to it. She learned, in the days that followed, that Daniel's fear of financial failure traced directly back to watching his father go from a strong, capable man to someone who needed to be fed and dressed after his stroke, and to a childhood belief, absorbed without anyone meaning to teach it to him, that a man who could not provide was a man who had failed completely. She learned that Christine's constant, silent giving traced back to a lifetime of believing love had to be earned through usefulness, a lesson she had carried so deeply that she had never once, in 18 months of quiet sacrifice, allowed herself to ask her mother directly whether she needed help, because asking felt like admitting weakness. And she learned, with a mixture of guilt and gratitude, that Mark's quiet, no-strings gift had cost him far more than any of them realized, sent not because he had anything to prove, but simply because, despite 6 years of distance, some part of him still could not stand the thought of his mother struggling alone. With all of this finally understood, Alina sat down with Renee to finalize her will, and the decision she made was not the tidy, sentimental ending anyone might have expected, and it was not simply a punishment either. It was the most honest reflection of everything she had learned. Christine would receive the largest outright share of Alina's estate, alongside a private letter Alina wrote by hand, apologizing for every year she let her daughter give without ever once saying thank you clearly enough, and thanking her for a kind of love that never once asked what it would receive in return. Mark would be named co-trustee of the estate alongside Christine, receiving an equal share, specifically because he had given the most freely with the least reason to, and because Alina wanted him, finally, to understand that his place in this family had never been the afterthought he believed it to be. Daniel would receive a smaller, carefully structured share, tied to mandatory financial counseling before any funds were released, not as a punishment, but as a boundary, accompanied by a letter in which Alina told her eldest son plainly that she still loved him completely. But that love did not mean funding a pattern that would eventually destroy him, and that the only way she knew to truly help him was to stop protecting him from the consequences he had spent his whole adult life avoiding. None of this fixed the family overnight, and Alina never expected it to. But something did begin to shift in the months that followed. Daniel, forced for the first time to face his debt directly instead of hiding it, began, slowly and painfully, to have honest conversations with his own wife about the truth of their finances, conversations that were difficult but that finally let him stop carrying the weight alone. Christine and Mark, who had drifted from each other almost as much as they had drifted from Daniel, began rebuilding something they had quietly let atrophy for years, a handful of phone calls becoming a habit becoming something close to closeness again. And Alina herself, for the first time in over a year, stopped performing poverty, sat her children down together, and told them the truth, all of it, the fall, the overheard phone call, the decision to disappear financially, the investigator, all of it, watching their faces as the full shape of what she had done finally became clear to them. Alina never got the version of family reunion that ties up neatly by the end of an hour. What she got instead was something more honest than that. She got to see, before it was too late, exactly who her children were capable of being, both at their most frightened and at their most generous. She learned that love tested is not the same as love destroyed, and that sometimes the only way to find out what is real is to risk finding out what is. If you found out that the people who cared for you were doing it without any expectation of what they'd receive, and that the one who claimed to worry about you most was actually counting down the days until there was something left to take, what would you decide to do? And could you find it in yourself to forgive the one who failed the test, once you finally understood the fear underneath it. If you made it to the end of Alina's story, thank you for staying. It means this story reached you, and that's exactly why we tell them. To see more stories like this, like and subscribe to this channel. We'll see you in the next one.